Hello and welcome to another tutorial. So this time round we are going to be taking a look at the area of dynamic UI. So what I mean by dynamic UI is I mean a user interface that gets built programmatically, so it gets built in code as the project is running. And that creates unique challenges for being able to position, for being able to resize and scale things. So we'll look at a few different ways of how we can work with that, and we'll look at a few different scenarios that we can run into there for this and how we can actually work with those. So to begin with, I haven't set up any of the UI intentionally because there's a few very key things I want to illustrate in the process for this. A few little things that I've learned make it a lot easier if I need to make changes later on. So it makes it easier for maintaining, extending, adding to it. So what I have set up is I've got these scriptable objects for notes, and every note has a title and it has content. What I want to set up is a UI where I can scroll through the titles of those notes, click on a note, and then that show up the particular text for it. So for this, we're going to need UI that can scroll, which means we're going to be using a bit of UI called a scroll view. Scroll views are one of those things that can be quite frustrating and challenging to work with. So that's why I wanted to show you building the UI from scratch and show you how we set those up, how we work with them to be able to actually have them do what we're needing to have them do. So to begin with, I am going to set up my UI. So I'm going to start with setting up, just adding in directly actually the scroll view, because I'm going to have two scroll views, one for the notes, so for picking the particular notes, and then one for being able to view the content. Now what I actually am going to do before that is I will add in a panel because this will allow me to just sort of group that UI. So the notes might only be a portion of our UI. So I'm going to do my usual thing with the scale mode. I generally prefer scale with screen size. And a reference resolution, I usually go for 1920 by 1080. I find that scales up and down fairly well. So that gives me that set up. My actual notes, one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the background to just be a dark color. Now my notes display, I don't actually want this taking up all of the screen. So I'm going to make this, yeah, that seems like a good positioning for that. Then I can block out my scroll view. So I'm going to need two scroll views for this. So firstly, I will add in my scroll view that's the list of notes. But again, I might want to constrain this within a panel so I can put titles there for things. So I'm actually going to set up two panels under this. And one of these is going to be the notes list, and this is going to be a fixed size on the left hand side. So making use of anchors, this is something I really can't emphasize enough, the value in doing that. It makes the process of building and constructing your UI much easier. So I've got that, then I create another panel, and this panel will be for the note content. Again, I don't need to particularly name these, but I generally recommend doing this because I think it makes it a lot easier to find things when you have a really busy UI hierarchy. So that looks good. We've got our setups there. So then in my notes list, now I will add in the scroll view. And I'll have a similar thing in the content. So I will add that in. Now these, by default, will have a horizontal and a vertical scroll bar. Now I don't need both the horizontal and vertical. In this case, I actually only need the vertical scroll bar. So if I want to go and remove these or turn them off, what I have to do first is in the actual scroll view itself, you'll see here how it links to the horizontal scroll bar. I click on that and hit delete, so it's no longer connected. So once it's no longer connected, I can turn this off. Do the same thing with the other one and turn that off. If I try and turn that off before I have made that change, it actually won't turn it off. It prevents it. And then my two vertical scroll bars, I change the bottom anchoring there to 0, so now it fills up the full space. So I can now make these scroll views, expand them. So I'm editing both at the same time because they're going to be configured in a similar way. So that looks good. We've got those set up. And what I would generally do is also rename these. So notes SV, note content SV. So a couple of key things with our scroll views. You will see where we add our elements to is under this content field. This content object is where they get added into, not under the viewport, anything like that, not in parallel to content. They must be a child of content, and content size needs to change to match the size of what's in that. So we'll have a look at how we do that. But first, I need to lay out my elements here for the particular controls. So firstly, I'm just going to turn off the parent images here. I think that will look better. And then I'm going to lay out what that particular element in here will look like. So this is how I go about doing this. I lay out one, and then I'll turn that into a prefab, test it with multiple, and then I know that I've got that at a good point. So I want these to be something I can click on. Now, default might be to go for a button, and we will end up having a button, but what I would recommend doing first is putting in a panel. I really strongly recommend using a panel, and you group things under that. It just makes it easier for if you're modifying parts of the UI later. It means you can block out a basic UI now, and then later on, if you're doing some polishing and refinement to it, you're only making updates in a very specific area. So it makes our UI more modular, which is always really handy. So this is going to be my note selector UI. And so that panel, I will reduce the size of this panel. So I'm going to, not that the anchoring is going to make too much of a difference, but this is just for initially positioning this. So height, probably 100. Then I'm going to create the button behind this. I will use Text Mesh Pro, and there's a couple of very specific reasons why I'm using Text Mesh Pro, and that's because I want to illustrate some very text-specific things later on. So my button there, I can expand that. And this is one where I can then, because I've got that panel behind this, I can do some extra coloring with that just to make it look so it stands out a little bit nicer, which can be good. So that looks pretty good. And what I would normally do is, again, I'm a big believer in making things modular because it helps with extendability. So I would actually have note selector UI. So I'd have a script that sits on this button. And the reason I would do that is so that the only thing that cares that there is actually a button here is this script. Nothing else needs to care about that. So this is going to have a function, public void on selected. Now it's going to need a way of being able to say that it was what thing was selected. So what I would typically do is give this the scriptable object, the data that it's linked to. So in this case, I note SO, so linked note. And what I like to normally set up is I refer to this as a bind function. So note SO note, because then we would say, well, linked note is equal to note, but we also need to populate the title. And this is, again, we bind it to a note and then it handles setting the title. It could set an icon, could do both, could color it, a lot of different things. And it means if we change that later on, we're changing it in that one specific area. So we would be using TM Pro. We'll have Text Mesh Pro UGUI. And this will be the linked text. Because then we can, when we bind to it, we say linked text.text is equal to the note's title. And then in onSelected, we'll need to notify something that we were selected. So we're going to set up using Unityengine.events. This is a great use case for events. So we want to set up our event for this. So what we would do is we would have public class note selected event. And we would say that's based off of Unity event node SO, because we'll pass through that note scriptable object. And we will mark this as serializable. That will allow us to say, okay, well, public note selected event on note selected equal to a new one. And then what we do down here is we just go on note selected, invoke linked note. So this will allow us to, it manages working with the fact of the button and everything there. It could be controlling color, stuff like that. So we just need to link up our script logic here. So our note selector UI, I've already got that attached on. So our button just links to it and to that particular function that we set up. So on selected. And then the final bit we do is we just link up the text. So that looks pretty good. Now, at the moment, if I just duplicate this, it's all adding in at the same location. So what we have to do is, what I would normally do is I duplicate a bunch of these, like heaps and heaps and heaps. And then on content, so this is how we set up for being able to organize it. So we know, in this case, a vertical layout group will properly stack them. So the first thing is we add in a vertical layout group. Now that will do this behavior. We know that's an expected thing. And then we turn on control child size width. We also turn off a force expand on the height. The reason for that is get rid of these. You can see that they stack neatly. Now that's pretty good, but if we just run with this, it won't scroll. And that's because our content hasn't changed in height. It needs to know that it's larger. So what we do is we add to this a content size fitter, and vertical fit we can set to min size. And we can see its height's changed. Now when we run this, it runs and we can scroll. So what we can do then is we get rid of all of those duplicates. We set up a location for our prefabs, and we turn this into a prefab, and then we can remove it. So now we can start to populate some things here. So my notes display, I'm going to set up the script for it. Note display UI, or maybe notes UI, the better name for it. So notes UI is going to need a bunch of things, because it's going to be responsible for adding in those prefabs. It's going to be responsible for when you click on a note. It's going to be responsible for a bunch of different areas there. So one of the things it definitely needs is it's going to need a list of the notes to display. That's going to be the first thing that it needs. It has to have that. Well, for displaying those clickable node areas, it needs to have the prefab to spawn. So we need a game object, note selector prefab, needs to know where to spawn them. So we need a transform for the note selector root. And then I'll also set up a public void on note selected note so note. So what I'm going to do then is in start, I create the UI. Then when it's selected, for now, all I'm going to do is go debug log note title, just so we know which one's selected. So let's go for creating the UI then. So for each var note in notes. So first thing I need to do is I need to instantiate that prefab. So instantiate the note selector prefab. It's just going to be at vector30 at identity rotation, and we give it the parent, which is good. So this is going to be the selector game object. Well, now I need to get the script on it because I need to bind to the event and also bind it to the particular note. So I would say selector script get component note selector UI. Then once I've done that, I would say selector script bind to this note and selector script on note selected add listener on note selected. So instantiate the game object, grab the script, and set it up. And that's actually going to be all that I need to do for it. I could make sure I have some nice naming here for this. So that's something that is often overlooked when you're procedurally creating UI. That can be a really handy thing to do. So that's another thing to consider doing there also. So what I could do is select a game object.name. It's equal to selector note.name, and that will use the file name of the scriptable object, which should be safe to use for an object name in the hierarchy. So now I just need to link this up and it will be spawning that UI. So bring in my notes UI. I need to give it the prefab, and then I need to link it to content here. So let's run this and see. What we're expecting is we get our list of notes appearing. So we're not getting a list of notes appearing, and that is because we overlooked adding in the list of notes. So we'll grab our note objects, add them in, and we're actually going to add them in multiple times just so that we can easily have plenty of data there. So now we'll run it again. So we're only seeing one of the things, and if we take a look at the error that we're getting, so that's failed to retrieve the selector script. So if we take a look at our prefab for the note selector UI, it does have that object on it. So it should mean, and this is easily overlooked. We were retrieving the script from the wrong game object. So now we've got all of our notes appearing, which is good. Click on note 1, saying the correct things. I can scroll. So that's good. We've got that part of the UI going. Now we need this next part for our content here. So this is just going to be showing some text. So this is going to have a text mesh pro. So this is going to be note content. And I'm going to change the color so it's a bit easier for us to see. And again, expand this out so it's filling up the full area. And what I would do is I would test with a whole bunch of text here. Because if we look, again, our content here, it's not setting the size. So, okay, let's add in a content size fitter. So add in a content size fitter, min size. And if you notice, that went to 0. So when we're working with TextMesh Pro for things, it can be a little bit tricky for managing the height for stuff like of this. So we actually have to do a few extra sort of steps here with this. So firstly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in TextMesh Pro. I'm going to set up so we have a link to the actual UI object, so for the note content. Also going to bring in, so I have my, in this case, the rect transform for the note content root, because that I'm going to directly set its size. So what I would do then down here is, well, my note content dot text is equal to my note content. But what I'm also going to do is we can ask TextMesh Pro to give us the size of something. So we need to ask TextMesh Pro for the size. And the way we do this is we can say note content get preferred values, and then we can give it the text, and we can also give it some extra information in terms of the width and the height of the area that it's in. So what we would be doing is note.content. Now we know the dimensions of the area that it's fitting in. So we can say note content root.rect.width, note content root.rect.height. And this gives us back the dimensions. Now, a couple of caveats with this. This is going to use the current settings on that TextMesh Pro object. That also means if the text that you're feeding into it is too complicated. So if you've got a lot of variations in font sizes, if you're adding in sprites, things like that, these values may not be fully correct. So that's something to be aware of. But that gives us back our dimensions, because once we've got our dimensions, then what we can do is we can actually set the size of this content area. So we could be saying, okay, well, note content root set size with current anchors. So we give it the axis. So I'm going to set the vertical one to dimensions .y. So that will set the size of it. So then with this up and running, what we will do is this text will obviously not be correct initially, and that's fine. We select our first note, so we need to link up our elements. We missed that. So we have our note content and our root for that. So we'll link this up. So we pick note 1. You can see the height's been updated. Pick note 2, changed again, 3, 4, and then our 5th note, which has intentionally very long text, and it works. We can scroll it. So regardless of which one, it's going to adapt the size based upon the content, which is really handy. Gives us a way of being able to have our UI be dynamic. It's going to adjust with screen scale now, and it's going to adjust with the content that we're adding in there, which is great. So we've seen how to handle dynamic UI where we're spawning in prefabs that's a fixed size, where we're working with some simple text that's just taking up the entire area. Now I want to make it a little bit more challenging and have it be something where we're putting things into a scroll view that all of them can be different sizes. Now this gets a little bit challenging, but we can make this work. So what we're going to do is create another panel down here. And this is going to be, let's say, message log display. And this panel, I will just adjust the height of it. There we go. So this is just going to have a single scroll view within it. And the scroll view is going to take up the full area, and it's going to hold all of the particular bits. So we don't need a horizontal scroll bar, so we'll turn that off and expand the vertical one. Now the challenge with this is going to be that the entries change in size. So this requires a very specific setup. So first thing I'm going to do is add in a panel as always and tint that. And we'll make it a dark reddish color. Looks good. So this will be message entry. And then this will have within that a text mesh pro. So this will be message content. Now the challenge is getting this all fitting exactly right. That's the bit that's tricky with this, because we've got multiple things that actually need to size, because this text is variable in size and the content that this is sitting in is also variable in size. So we've got a lot of different elements that are able to be changing size. So we need to work with the layout system quite carefully to achieve the effect that we need. So there's a very, very specific setup that we're going to have to go for this. So we can do our usual setup here where with the content, we have a vertical layout group. We control the width and we turn off the force expand in height. And we also add in a content size fitter, going for min size or preferred size, either one will work. Now message entry, when we did that, it shrank its size way down. So we need to restore that. So, okay, we'll restore a bit of size there. This now means we're at least at the point where we can do that, where we've got that side of things working, which is good. And we'll set up our little script for this, message entry UI, and we'll also set up our script for just the actual message log. So script for message log UI. So our message entry one is going to need to control a couple of different things. And our message log one will be the thing that manages the actual displaying of all of these on the screen. So before we start linking to setting up the particular things for sizing, let's just get our actual initial setup here going for this. So our actual message is going to obviously need Text Mesh Pro. It's going to need to link to the text. So it's going to need link to our Text Mesh Pro GUI, message content, and it's going to need our bind function text. I'll make that message text, and we're going to need to set that. So message content dot text is equal to message text. So far, fairly familiar. Our message log one is going to also be pretty similar to what we've used before, where we're going to have a list of, we'll just use the notes for our messages. We're going to need a game object message entry prefab. And we're also going to need to know where we're spawning that. So message entry root. So then these are a pretty straightforward process, almost identical to what we had for the notes. So message in messages. We do the same instantiation exactly as we did before. Our message game object. We instantiate our prefab, default positions, default rotation, and we give it its entry point. Then we can grab the component on it, so our message entry UI, and we bind to our message content. So most of the code-wise so far is very similar. Now this will initially not work. We know that it's not going to work the way that we need, and that's okay. The goal is we're going to get our prefab set up, and I'm going to turn this one here off just so we can have one there that's easy to be working with. And so we'll link up our prefab. We'll get all of the bits linked up so it'll spawn things, but it won't be correct, and that's okay. So we just want to make sure that the spawning's working, and then we'll be able to fix up so that it's actually linking to the correct things. So we run this, we're expecting it to spawn things, but for it to work exactly like this, where the sizing of everything is not correct. So this is where the extra bit now comes in for getting this sizing correctly. And this is where there's a couple of very specific steps we need to do for this. So how we go about setting this up is, well, on our top level one here, so the panel for this, we add in a content size fitter, and we can set that to its preferred size. And we also add in a horizontal layout group, and we'll take off height, but expand in width. We can set some padding here if we need. So now the height of our panel is going to be driven by the height of the text here. So whatever that text height is, it will drive it. Now we could add a content size fitter here. The problem is that does not update immediately, and we need to force a refresh. So because of the sort of depth we're going with the hierarchy here, it means that we would get the UI not looking correct. What we can do, because we've already seen how to, is we will set the rect, particularly the height, of our text here based upon its content in code when we bind it, and that way then the messages will look correct from the beginning. So we've updated that prefab, so we will apply, and then with that applied, I'm actually now going to remove that, and then in here we link up the text. Now we're going to update the sizing of things. So when we're updating the sizing of this, well, we need to talk to our text. So we need to go, okay, well, message content, get preferred values. So let's try initially just not providing anything in there. We'll just get the actual preferred values from that. For dimensions, it's equal to that. So it should use the existing text, the existing width information that it has. And then what we're updating is that message content, its transform, and we grab that as a rect transform. Then we can do set size with current anchors, axis vertical, dimensions.y. So let's test with this. So we'll run, and we're getting the sizing working. And it's sized immediately. If we just used a content size fitter on the actual text mesh pro object, it wouldn't have sized immediately. What we have to do, would have had to do, is actually kick off an update pass in the UI, and you will get a frame delay there where you see it look incorrect. So by doing this in code, at that stage where we populate the text, it means that it works correctly. So now we've got something where it will resize with differently sized objects in it. So we've seen two different versions of, kind of almost three different versions of working with dynamic UI. Adding in fixed size things, adding in a single thing of a variable size, and adding in a variable number of things with each of them being a different size and it auto-sizing. So we've seen how we can approach all of those. So dive in and experiment with this stuff and see the kinds of cool things that you can be creating there with it. So as always, the full code for this project is available up on GitHub. You can use that in any of your own projects. And I really do hope you found the video helpful. If you have, please do chuck in a like and subscribe. It really does help out. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, I do have a Patreon. The link to that is in the description below. And if you've got any questions, chuck in a comment. Always happy to help out. Bye.